we meet people when we first encounter them. And there are three questions, right? We first want to know, what's your name? And then we want to know, what do you do? Because we're so judgy as humans. We just judgy. We want to know, are you a farmer? Are you a pharmacist? Right. So we can kind of label and categorize. And then we typically ask people, where are you from? And I think regionality matters, but a deeper question perhaps is, who are you from? And so part of my context
Oh,
is also to share the who I am from, right? I am from this rich collective of ancestors who are activists and who are Jewish and who are Black and who are survivors.
welcome to the Blueprint Breakers podcast. What is a blueprint breaker? If you live your life outside the typical traditional lifestyle blueprint, you are a blueprint breaker. We are here to start a conversation, to assemble resources, and to build a community. This podcast is for empowered women in midlife and beyond who are preparing for a powerful next era of life. My name is Amy A. Palmer. I am your host and facilitator for our conversations. Sit back, relax, enjoy the show. To stay connected, up to date, and to receive all of our free resources and gifts along the way, join us at community.blueprintbreakers.com. Who are you from? Today's episode will expand your mind in ways you may not have thought about lately or ever. It is with great privilege that I introduce you to the magnificent Chevara Orrin. Chevara shares a message of interconnectedness that we all need to hear. We talk about her childhood struggles with poverty, domestic violence, and navigating her mixed race heritage. We also discuss her current passions, such as research-driven and culturally curious travel, and the work she does to bring diversity, equity, and inclusion to corporations. Chevara is an award-winning diversity and inclusion practitioner, social entrepreneur, published author, social justice activist, independent filmmaker, and dynamic public speaker. Her work and passion lives at the intersection of gender parity, racial equity, LGBTQ equality, and arts activism. I do need to give you a trigger warning for this episode. The episode discusses some very sensitive topics, such as violence, domestic violence, sexual assault. If you need help or support, please call the National Sexual Assault Hotline at 1-800-656-4673. I encourage you to connect with Chevara. I included all of her social media links in the show notes. Follow her journey, hear her stories. She does an amazing job of connecting the dots for us all and reminding us of our humanity. Hello, Chevara. Welcome to Blueprint Breakers.
Oh, Amy, thank you so much for having me. Such an honor to be here.
Well, I've known since the day I met you that I wanted you to be here at some point. When we met in Bali last year, I was so thrilled that we were part of the same retreat and that I got to sort of hear about your history and your stories and your experiences. And as you know, here at Blueprint Breakers, we talk about celebrating women who are living a life outside the traditional lifestyle blueprint, and you are definitely that. And so I just thought that it was my audience is going to love to meet you and hear from you. So I'd love to hear a little bit about your story and what it's been like to forge your own path.
Yeah, I don't even know where you want me to begin. So it's interesting. And I guess I'll begin at the beginning. I think it's really important to set context for how I show up in this world. So I show up in this world identifying as a Black woman. I identify as a Black woman who is also biracial, the daughter of a white Jewish mother and a Black father. I identify as a Black woman who is mixed race, who has the privilege of able-bodiedness. I am cisgendered and heterosexual. I'm formally educated. I identify as a mother. I have two Black adult sons. I identify as a survivor, as someone who has navigated the journey of childhood abject poverty, standing in food stamp lines, walking to free healthcare clinics, eating government subsidized food on a two-burner hot plate. I identify as someone who has also navigated and survived childhood domestic violence and sexual violence, incest more specifically. And I share those aspects of identity because it absolutely informs not just how I show up in my work, the work that I do in this world, but how I show up as a human, whether it's here in my local community or across the globe, as you and I met in Bali, And so I think that those types of identities, the intersection of identity, is really important to acknowledge because there are some places where I absolutely hold incredible privilege, and many places where I am disadvantaged or oppressed, even depending on where I am in the world. And so I like to begin with that context setting. And also, I'm coming to you today from my home here in South Florida, the colonized and traditional land of the Tequesta, Calusa, and Seminole for anyone else who might be in my part of the world. It's interesting when you talk about journeying. I was having a conversation with my mother just a couple of months ago, and there's much about my own lived experience, my childhood, my relationship with my mother, that I've known for a long time. And she shared something with me, and I think this actually gets to the crux too of what it means. You and I talked a lot about healing the last time we were together, and what it means not necessarily to be fully healed, but to be wholly healed. WHOLLY, for those of you out there listening land, not HOLY, wholly healed, not fully healed. And my mother and I were talking about my birth. And I've known for a very, very long time that my white Jewish grandparents were distressed, to put it mildly, about me being born and being Black. And my mother was unwed and she was a radical activist. And they disowned her for several months after my birth. And I've known that for a very long time. And ultimately, I had a loving relationship with my grandmother before she died quite a few years ago. But my mother shared something that I did not know. As we were talking about this, and she was sharing some stories, and I was asking questions, she said to me, she was talking about Nana, my great grandmother. And she said that her mother, my grandmother, once told her that Nana cried herself to sleep every single night because I was Black. And when she said it, I crumpled to my knees in my kitchen. And I was surprised that I crumpled to my knees. And my mother quickly, I could hear her on the phone reassuring me it was their ignorance, it was their misunderstanding. And while I knew that to be true, in that moment, I was struck by how painful it is to know you are not wanted or loved from the moment you arrived.
Yeah.
And so I share that story because it's, for me, I've been grappling lately with what does it mean to be born into that level of violence or unacceptance, and at the same time be deeply loved, because I was loved by my mother. And when I think about my childhood, and even before my childhood and my own birth, the generational trauma, the generational resilience of my ancestors, my Jewish ancestors who immigrated from Kiev, Russia, and from Hungary, and my Black ancestors who toiled on plantations, that has always been and still is such a core part of how I show up in this world, and what leads me to even be inspired to do the type of things that I do work-wise, but also the travel and the way that I have, especially in more recent years, the last 5 to 7 years, chosen to live my life outside of the margins, outside of the lines, outside of what's expected.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Yeah. I mean, it's been such a journey for you right from the beginning, and just the fact that you've been able to navigate so many worlds and so many various situations and circumstances, just speaks to your own ability. Like before we started recording today, you were telling me about your trip to Cuba, and how the gentleman that you met was talking about how there's just this energy about you that draw people to you, so in variety of different situations and circumstances and things. And I so admire how you bring that to the world as you're out there traveling and exploring. So I'd love to hear a little bit about that as you've taken these experiences. And I love how you started with the context of how you identify, because it does speak to what you bring and the perspective that you bring and your ability to empathize and understand with so many different groups of people. I mean, that's like one of your superpowers, right? So I'd love to hear a little bit about how you bring that out into the world as you're out exploring and traveling and meeting people.
Yeah, thanks for that. It's so interesting. That context setting. I this, and for your listening audience, in my professional life, I am a diversity, equity, and inclusion practitioner, public speaker, published author, independent filmmaker, and so often we meet people. I mean, when we first encounter them, and there are three questions, right? We first want to know what's your name. Hopefully, we want to know what's your name. What's your name? And then we want to know, what do you do? Because we're so judgy as humans. We just judgy. We want to know, are you a farmer? Are you a pharmacist? Right? So we can kind of label and categorize. And then we typically ask people, where are you from? And I think regionality matters, but a deeper question perhaps is, who are you from? And so part of my context is also to share the who I am from, right? I am from this rich collective of ancestors who are activists and who are Jewish and who are Black and who are survivors. And in my work, what has been very useful, particularly as I'm working with global corporations and nonprofit organizations and arts institutions, academic spaces that I find myself, even governmental agencies, the wide range of experiences that I have had, I do believe allow me to have a unique perspective and lens, if you will, into the work that I'm doing. One of the lenses I know that I bring to my work is the socioeconomic perspective of growing up in poverty. And so if I'm in a room with executives, all who are making 6, 7, 8 figures sometimes, who have forgotten or perhaps have never been connected to someone in the hierarchical chain of the organization who might be making $13 an hour, oftentimes, the decisions that they are making do not serve the needs of most of the people within the organization. What I've discovered in my travels, and I do try to show up around the globe with cultural humility, this understanding that while there might be a particular practice or culture or community that is unfamiliar to me, it is not my place, ever. No matter how ideologically opposed I might be to it, to be in judgment, to sit in judgment. A good example, and I was talking with someone about this just recently, when we were in Bali, and I had researched this because before I travel, and I'll share that up until a few years ago, I wasn't traveling in this way. The pandemic and George Floyd made it very heavy, not just for me, but I know for so many people in your listening audience too. You might have found yourselves feeling overwhelmed with the sadness and the heaviness of it all. And for me, it was particularly challenging because I was working in spaces where Black people, people of color who had been traumatized for centuries, were for the first time being able to voice that. And white people and non-Black people were for the first time discovering that racism still existed and perhaps was deeper entrenched than it had ever been in the history of our young nation. And in an effort to find some harmony and some balance in my own life, I decided that my meditative practice of going to the ocean every morning just wasn't enough, and I needed to seize Black girl joy. So I bought a bike and I started cycling. I started kayaking every Saturday. And then I was working on a client project. actually St. Jude Children's Research Hospital, and their CEO and their founder, Danny Thomas, are of Lebanese descent. And I was doing all this intense research into Lebanon, and I decided I need to travel to Lebanon to better understand what it meant for this group of people, Danny Thomas's parents and their cousins and uncles and aunties, to show up in this America. So I traveled to Lebanon, toured the country, stayed in Beirut, visited 11 cities, and then decided after that, you know what, for the next year, I'm going to travel to a different nation every month. That's how I am going to practice Black Girl Joy. That was 2.5 years ago. And back to what I was coming forward with, when I was in Bali, when we were in Bali, I had done some research. And so I knew that it was possible that at the temples, I might be asked the question of whether or not I was menstruating. And if I was menstruating, I was then deemed unclean. Kantaka is the word that they talk about. And it's not just for menstruation. You could have an illness, or perhaps someone close to you had died. And so I'm at one of the temples, and this happened at 2 of the 4 temples that I visited. And when the elder asked me, I responded. I was actually in the beginning of these power surges I'm starting to have. So I'm like, I'm actually in the middle of a power surge. And he and I ended up having this in-depth conversation about what that means for women in Bali, for women in the United States. When I was in Panama a couple of months ago, in Panama, I was with the Kuna people, and they were sharing with me that when a young girl is menstruating, it's a celebration. And they showed me molas that they made that are embroidered with women on them. And the young girl is taken into a home for 4 days, and everyone brings her gifts, and people bring song and dance. And it is something to be celebrated by the entire community. 2 very different cultures, dissimilar to my own. And how that's relevant, like in the world today, in my own work, I shared that story with some energy oil sector executives down in Houston. And one of the leaders, she raised her hand kind of tentatively. And she said, and she looks around the room and she says it solemnly, "We have a colleague." She said, and I just learned this 3 months ago, that every month when our colleague is on her period, she has to leave her home. She goes to another home and she sleeps on this cardboard mat for 3 to 5 days every month. And she only discovered it because the colleague was not performing like work-wise and seemed disconnected. And as she had the conversation with her, because she wasn't sure what was going on, this is what surfaced. Everyone in the room was shocked. And she said, I wouldn't have even shared that, Chevara, except that you just told us these stories about Bali and Panama and how this is showing up for women around the world. And so, you know, when I think about the connectedness between a practice in Bali that inhibits women from walking into a temple, a practice, a cultural practice in Panama that celebrates and uplifts this life change, and a boardroom, a conference room in Houston with oil sector execs. And we might not otherwise be making these types of connections.
Right, right. Wow. I mean, that's part of the gift that you're bringing. I feel like you are helping to connect these dots at a time when the world is like more divided than ever, right? Like we're all whatever. I feel like with the example that you just shared too, that you're sort of connecting the dots for us. You're showing some of our common humanity, and what brings us together. So, wow, thank you for that.
Thank you. It's interesting. You talk about common humanity. I often use the language of we are inextricably bound, and we are.
Yeah.
And you are right.
Yeah.
There is deeper polarization when we look at our healthcare system, our education system, when we look at infrastructure. We have widening disparities in the United States of America, not lessening. We have the banning of books. We have a misinterpretation and a dissemination of unfactual information about our history. And one of the things that I was sharing with some executives recently is that they were balking and pushing back on this idea that they should somehow be involved politically and what's happening in the world, that these political discussions and these policies don't really impact us. I say, well, in 5 to 10 years, these middle and high school students who are having books taken out of their classrooms and their libraries, who are learning here in Florida where I live that somehow there was a benefit for those who were enslaved on those slave plantations because we got skills. Those will be the people in your workforce. So they will be more ignorant. They will be less able to be in community with and understand and have deeper empathy for their cultural others.
Right.
That's the
Right.
workforce that you'll be inheriting.
Absolutely. Absolutely. A couple questions come to mind, a couple of comments too. First of all, I want to highlight for the audience, I want them to really see the difference in how you travel. For example, yes, I met you in Bali. We both had a wonderful trip in Bali. I think I stayed in Bali longer than you did, and yet you went deeper into Bali than I did. Like you just have this way of, and I'm not sure if it's something that you plan for ahead of time or if it's instinctual, but you have this way of being able to seek out the local experiences, the unique culture nuances, and like you said, you come to it with such reverence for their culture. So I think that that's what opens up. But you're just able to soak up so much more. I'm curious if you have any I don't know, tips on or any thoughts on how you do that?
Yeah, I told you I spend a couple of weeks researching all the nations before I go because I travel mostly solo in this world. You know what that is like, and still as women folk in this world, there's a lot of oppression, there's a lot of violence, things that we have to be more mindful of, perhaps, than people who do not hold female identity. So I'm interested first in politically what's happening in a nation. Doesn't necessarily mean I won't go if there's political strife, because I have absolutely shown up in nations where there have been protests, where there have been ongoing conflict around policy. I am interested deeply in a couple of things. I'm interested first in how Black people are experiencing the world. So an example of that might be spending time with Black Cubans, some people who identify as Afro-Cuban. I cooked in the home of a Santeria priest with people who identified as Afro-Cuban when I was in Havana. I am interested deeply in how women are experiencing this world. And so some of the research that led me to Iceland was around the political prowess and the fact that women have held political office since the 1980s. And I spent time with a sociologist who told me this fascinating story that she was 10 years old and all she had known was a female president. And she said, it's not like in the United States where your political figures have armed guards and they're followed. The president, she would be walking through the neighborhood and waving. And she's like, good morning. Hi, how are you? How's school going? And so she's 10 years old and all she's ever known is a woman as president. And there's an election coming up. And she says that there were 4 people running for office, 2 men and 2 women. And her mother was raising her as a single parent. And she said, I was learning to be a feminist, even though I didn't have the language of feminism yet in my own vocabulary. And her mother, interestingly, had decided that one of the male candidates was the superior candidate, was the person who was most aligned with what was important to her. So they're around the dinner table, and her mother announces that she's voting for this man. And she says, I look at my mother with all this bewilderment, and I say, Mama, you can't vote for him. Men can't be presidents. Only women can be presidents. And Amy, in that moment, and I chuckled, and then I thought,
Yeah.
how powerful would it have been if little girl Chevara had known that at 10?
Mm.
Women could be presidents, that Chevara could be president, that Chevara could be self-sufficient and she could be financially secure and she could be safe in this world. Phenomenal. I'm also interested in how LGBTQ people are navigating this world. In Lebanon, I spent time with some folks who are deep actually underground for fear of losing their lives. And I attended an underground drag show. And they actually blindfolded me to take me into the place. There was a lot of trust on both of our parts around this. And I had shared with them that when I was living in North Florida, I created an entire campaign, a print ad, video campaign. I produced a documentary about a transgender woman who transitioned over 35 years ago, who now is in her 70s. And that campaign changed the face of that community of 1 million people. That policy was passed. And even with all of that, there was this trepidation of, could I cause them harm? And so I recognized in that moment too the privilege of my heteronormativity, right? How privileged I am in a place like Lebanon to show up as a cisgendered heterosexual woman in a community where people had to kind of smuggle me into these spaces where they find joy and camaraderie and kinship and community. I am interested deeply in gender differences. In Togo, I went to a community called Togoville that's a matriarchal society where the men there don't have to get permission from, but they get guidance from the women who live with them, mothers, aunties, sisters, daughters, and the deities that people go and pray before are matriarchal and protected in this community. And so the way that I think about the world is also the way that I think about my own life. As a mixed race woman, I am deeply curious. How do mixed race people call themselves in a nation? Have they found a place of balance, or are they ostracized from the two communities from whence they came? And perhaps one of the more powerful stories that I've come across, and one of the stories that has most deeply impacted me, is the story of the Métis that I discovered when I was in Belgium. I chose Belgium because of Congo and because of Leopold's pillage and land grabbing and annihilation of Congo. And what I discovered when I was after George Floyd's murder, in Belgium, like many other places in the world, these commissions, race relation commissions, were created to kind of get at the crux of what's happening with race relations in the world, which for many of us, we have always known it's been happening in the world. So they had a commission to explore what happened in Congo. And I learned while I was there that the commission had been disbanded. It had imploded because half of the commission had decided that, well, we've acknowledged the horror that Belgium enforced on Congo, and that's enough. And the other part of the commission said, well, what about reparations? What about restitution? In the midst of all of that, what was surfacing was what had happened to these Métis. And so when King Leopold had sent his soldiers over and they were pillaging and stealing and cutting off the hands and limbs of children because their fathers weren't working fast enough in these rubber tree forests, they were also raping the women of Congo and Burundi and Rwanda. And what the estimates say, and I've read a wide range of sources, is somewhere between 14 and 20,000 mixed race babies were born. And those babies were called Métis. And what the government decided after these babies were born is that the babies belonged to Belgium and that these African mothers couldn't possibly raise these children. And so they issued a decree. They go over and they steal all these children. They abduct them and they bring them back to Belgium. And in Belgium, many of them are placed in Catholic orphanages where they are mistreated. They are told they are children of sin. Some of them report that they were raped with candlesticks by the soldiers who were sent there to protect them. Their names were taken. They weren't given birth certificates. The ones who were adopted to families, they lost all connection with their culture. Fast forward. We're talking about the 40s and 50s. Fast forward, these humans are now in their 70s. And several years ago, 5 of these women, these Métis women, filed a lawsuit against the government for crimes against humanity. And they lost because the government said, we placed you in religious institutions. And then last year, the very first Métis man, who's 74, got his birth certificate. And so when I think about the connection for me to that story, when I was a little girl, My white Jewish mother, who's now 80 and she's still doing the work. She's an anti-Vietnam War, anti-apartheid, human rights, civil rights activist. And we were living in a house in Baltimore when I was 3 years old. And a group of Black women who were living in that house surrounded my mother one night in conversation, and they were adamant that she give me to the Black community. And they basically said, there's no way that you can raise Chevara. You can't raise this Black girl in America. You won't be able to teach her what she needs to know about her culture. You won't be able to protect her. When my mother told me this story a few years ago, tears were streaming down her face, and she said she sat there for hours listening. I'm a mother. I was that 19-year-old pregnant, that 20-year-old breastfeeding, taking notes in the back of a college classroom. And maybe I was defiant or I just was too naive. I couldn't imagine someone coming to me and telling me they were going to take my children because I was too poor, that I was too uneducated, that, I was still in college. And I asked her why she stayed and listened. And she said, because they might have been right. And what I didn't want to do as a white woman in this America is to be creating and causing you harm. Amy, that's probably one of the deepest lessons in humility that I have ever received. So the connection to my mother sitting in Baltimore with me as a 3-year-old and this group of well-meaning Black women saying that you need to give Chevara to Black community to be raised. And these Métis children, these babies in Africa, their mothers being told, you can't possibly raise these children, and so we're going to abduct them and take them back. Two different circumstances, but there is a thread of connection around what does it mean to be both of a culture, right? Sometimes people will say, I'm 50-50, or I've got 23 chromosomes. I am 100% Black and I am 100% Jewish.
Mm-hmm.
I am all of those things, right? So what does it mean? And it's interesting. It's very interesting. I was just in Cuba a few days ago, and I met with a man who was talking to me about how colorism shows up in Cuba and what does it mean in Cuba because of the mixing of so many cultures. So that's one of the areas that I'm deeply interested in. And I seek out people who share those lived experiences wherever I am in the world.
Mm. Well, your learnings and your experiences and your expression, I mean, those are definitely your gifts to the world. I'm curious, how have you been able to get into those rooms with those mostly white, mostly male executives of these large corporations and get them to listen to you? I mean, you've crafted a very successful career helping corporations and try to draw some of those bridges. I'd love to hear, like, how did you make that happen?
Yeah, I appreciate that. I've been in this space really as a consultant only since 2019, 2018, 19. I had a wide range of career experiences, which I know you mentioned in your introduction, but I decided more formally to go into this space. And what I have discovered, and this has been this has been a journey, because I don't just do this work. I call it a passion gig. My friends tease me. They'll say, so how's your passion gig? I'm like, how's your job? Two different things. I don't just do this work as a diversity, equity, and inclusion practitioner. I live each day as a Black woman in this world. So I'm also having the lived experience of Blackness while I'm in these spaces, which is different than just theoretically talking about some of the injustices and the inequities that exist within these capitalistic corporations. And there's a phrase that you hear often. I'm sure you've heard this before. People will say, you've got to meet people where they are. I believe that to be true. And I also meet people where they aren't. I meet people where they are not. And a really good example was with a corporate client, maybe right before the holiday, the December holiday. And I've been working with this particular corporation for 2.5 years. And there were 9 cohorts of these leaders. And the final 2 cohorts of these leaders It's mandatory by the president of this organization. So there's no getting out of it. But the folks who were in the final two cohorts, not all of them, but most of them, were people who didn't sign up the whole rest of the year because they either don't believe in it, they are adverse to it, or they just are in opposition of this type of shift and change. And one of the leaders came to me after the very first session. It's a 4-month, 4-hour module. So I'm with them for 4 months. I go up each month. And in the session, he made the comment. He said, and this is not a word I use. I had an aunt once who navigated mental illness. And so I am very careful with my language, but I'm going to share this because I think it's really important too when we think about what it means for people to evolve, even around language. He says, I'm the one probably crazy Republican in the room. He said, and I didn't want to be here because I thought you were going to be forcing CRT down our throats. He says this in the session in front of all these other corporate leaders. He said, but what I must say, Chevara, is I'm agreeing with like 90% of everything that you're saying. And this was right before break. So we go to break and I go over to him and I'm curious. I say, I appreciate, what you shared earlier. And I am curious, what is resonating? He said, I feel as though you are connecting with my humanity. You aren't vilifying me. I came here expecting to be vilified. I came here expecting to be told that everything that I believed was wrong. I came here expecting that you wouldn't let me even speak or share my perspective. What I say at the beginning of all of my sessions, of all of the engagements that I do with corporate folks, institutional clients, is all perspectives are welcome here. We will not hold space for harm. All perspectives are welcome. We will not hold space for harm. And if people need further elaboration, it means that your freedom becomes oppressive the moment it starts to impede on my freedom. And that could be around race, that could be around sex, that could be around gender, that could be around ability. It doesn't matter, whatever that looks like. And I also have to be transparent in my physicality. I show up in this world with a certain phenotype. I am not immune to thinking that it's just some magic, although a lot of my clients will say when they send me messages, it was magical what you did here. I recognize that I show up as someone who is racially ambiguous in these spaces, and that my colleagues who are darker complected, I'm also diminutive in size. I'm 5'5" in stilettos. My skin complexion, my hair texture, that's privilege too. The fact that I'm formally educated and I have a certain type of diction, right? So it is not lost on me that all of those dimensions of diversity are working in tandem with also the authenticity that I bring into a space. I have an ability, and I think I will use the word gift because it's not something I've learned. And so it's sometimes difficult to teach when people are asking, can you teach this? I believe I've been gifted with the ability to connect with people in a way that allows them to be seen and that allows us to feel each other's humanity. Validation without giving a pass or minimizing the impact that someone's privilege or position might have on an organization. And it's a fine balance. And it doesn't mean that there's not tension in sessions. That happens all the time. I have countless times where I find myself as mediator, or I myself am harmed by something that someone says, typically something that's racist or sexist in a space. And so I'm navigating, I'm still learning. It's an evolutionary journey. I don't have the solve. There's not, a playbook necessarily. Yeah. Every single client project is different. And because of the socio-political climate that's ever evolving, even recently, I had a client in Boston, and what's happening in Palestine showed up in the workplace. And those are difficult conversations. And what I have learned, and probably one of the more difficult lessons for me just in my own life, has actually been a lesson that I've been able to transfer. It's a transferable skill. I mentioned earlier that I'm a survivor of sexual violence. And my father, who is a renowned civil rights leader and activist, Reverend James Bevel, he was the first to call for the march from Selma to Montgomery. He's considered the father of voting rights in America. He's the architect of the Birmingham Children's Crusade. He was the one who decided that children would be put on the front lines. Those images that we see of small Black children, their tiny bodies hurled down a city street, grown white men, firefighters, wielding fire hoses, that water pressure strong enough to pull bricks from buildings, to rip skin from bodies. That was my father's decision to do that. When President Kennedy saw those images and the world saw those images, that's what shifted consciousness. My father and Dr. King and a brilliant educator, Al Raby, initiated the Chicago open housing movement, which led to the 1968 Fair Housing Act. And with all of that greatness, I vote. I have all of these privileges as a Black woman in America because of my father. I also suffered at the hands of my father. He is my perpetrator. And the lesson of forgiveness that I have chosen for myself, that I do not suggest at all that anyone else follow. I think all of us who have navigated and survived extreme violence have our own right to determine what that journey looks like. I have chosen healing and forgiveness. Being able to forgive my father and to recognize that his brilliance, his commitment to humanity as a civil rights leader, and his pedophilia were inextricably bound. That was the complexity of who he was. And there's a quote, and I'm paraphrasing because I might not be getting it right. The brilliant Bryan Stevenson, who wrote the book Just Mercy, the film Just Mercy, and is the architect of the lynching memorial and museum down in Alabama. He says that we are all better than the worst things we have ever done. And so when I am in sessions, particularly with white people who have not come to grips with the privilege that they hold, who are challenging the lived experiences of people of color, of Black people, of brown people, of Asian folks, of Hispanic, Latinx people in this community, I have built, I'll have to say built, I built capacity to hold space for that, for their ignorance, for their unknowing. I hold space and I hold out hope that there is opportunity for evolution for them. And I never, ever have worked with a client where I have felt hopeless, that there is no hope that there can be institutional and systemic change, that there is no hope that someone's heart and mind can be expanded. And for me, what I most am interested in, and I often say this when I'm with my clients, is I am not here to change your mind. I am here to invite you to be expansive in your consciousness, that there is a different history, that there is a different journey, that sometimes both things can be true, as in the case of my father. And so that has allowed me, I believe, to be able to make the type of connections. And I come with hard facts and truths and data, but it is those stories that connect us. People will forget the data points. They will remember the story that their colleague shared about the woman in the organization who every single month sleeps on a cardboard mat. They
Right.
will remember that story. And maybe they'll think about that as they're thinking about gender parity, when they're thinking about how the pink tax impacts female employees, when they're thinking about menstrual leave, when they're thinking about miscarriage leave. There's a connection there. And so I
Right.
try to make that clear and to help people along on the way.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's the way that you share your own experience and then connect it with other human experience. Again, it's looking at our common threads. It's looking at what brings us together. That makes the difference. Oh, wow. It's what's interesting to me also is you are the epitome of authenticity to me, and very open and transparent with your sharing. And I come from a very deep corporate background, and so I just when I envision the fact that you've found those corporate environments that have been open, and that have been open to your level of authenticity, it gives me hope. And the fact that you expressed hope gives me hope, because I'm sure you've come up against those that others might not have had that hope, that they have that ability to expand their minds and look at other perspectives and accept other people's realities and all of that. So thank you for that. And it does give me hope that these conversations are happening and these connections are happening. Things are really difficult right now in the world. There's so many things going on. There's so many challenges and conflicts, and the wars around the world, everything. Do you have any thoughts on from my view, it seems like you do a great job, and I don't know, but you could correct me, but you do a great job of being able to contribute, make a difference, have that impact, and not let it shut you down completely, not let it stop you, or just getting burnt out and getting overwhelmed, all of those things. I'd love to hear your perspective on that.
That's been a journey in and of itself, too. I have navigated for most of my life extreme depression. And I have a therapist now. I've had a therapist for a while. One of the tools that one of my therapists gave me about maybe 5, 6 years ago during the pandemic and George Floyd, probably when I was at one of my most heavy times, I had some rituals. And I remember my therapist saying, I need you to add more rituals. And I remember saying, my pushback was, I already have 6. She's like, get 15. I'm like, 15 rituals? That's too many rituals. And what I have learned for myself, and I bring this into my practice of work, I bring in meditation. I travel with lavender oil and set it up on tables and podiums in corporate spaces. And I tell people, there's lavender oil up here. If it gets too intense, please come get some. I got stress balls on tables. I invite people, if you need to sit on the floor with your legs crossed, if you need to stand, if you need to pace, whatever it is that you need to do to be engaged in a conversation so that you are honoring your body. So I began with that in corporate spaces. I play music. I wake up every morning and when I'm home, I cycle to the ocean for sunrise. I've added a practice of infrared yoga. I have practiced yoga every single day this year because every day this year thus far. I work out every single day. I'm a vegetarian. I have chosen to also, from my personal life, the ideology that I have around this do no harm and how we're in community extends to how I choose to eat and what I put into my body. And all of that, all of that. And it doesn't mean that it doesn't get heavy for me. Right now, the work that I do is under assault. We have policies here in my own state of Florida. I'm one of 3 plaintiffs in a lawsuit right now against Governor Ron DeSantis's Stop Woke Act. Judge Walker ruled in our favor last year. The governor has appealed and we are waiting final decision. So the sector that I am most engaged with on a day-to-day basis is absolutely under assault. I often go back to the wisdom of ancestors and those folks who have come before us. There's a brilliant book by Dr. Carol Anderson, a professor. She was at Emory, and it's called White Rage. And she talks about how white rage is in response to Black progress. When President Obama, for example, was elected president, when you look at some of the data that came out after that, hate groups in the United States increased threefold. So there is always this pushback to progress. And I try to temper the hopelessness that I might be feeling on any given day. I mean, the hopelessness in the world with the both and that there is also hopefulness, right? It is possible to feel hopeless and hopeful simultaneously. And for me, it ebbs and flows. And I have also made it a practice to disconnect who I am as Chevara to a title of a job or the work. I am not my work. I am not my work. And in whatever iteration the work shows up, the justice work, DEI, I didn't even know DEI was a sector until a few years ago. I've been doing justice work my whole life. I had no idea that DEI was even a sector. So I'm not bound by the sector of diversity, equity, and inclusion. I have expansiveness in the world in terms of how I show up to move, whether it's policy, practice, culture, heart, mind. And so for me, all of that is what sustains me. And it shifts. It shifts too. You know, it's an ever, for myself, it's an ever evolving practice of wellness and self-care. But what I have chosen to do in the past 6 to 7 years, more specifically, is I prioritize my wellness. I prioritize my wellness. I am not engaged or involved in any work-related project until I first take care of myself. I build it in. I build in massages after sessions. I build in kayaking and boat rides in these cities. I take city tours in every community that I'm in, wherever I'm doing work. I'll travel in a day and go take a hiking tour. I go to museums. I have absolutely built that in. And that wasn't taught to me. I also believed in the grind, the American dream, that we're supposed to grind and grind in the 40, 50, 60-hour work week. It's a narrative that I have chosen to divest myself from.
Right. Oh, thank you for that. I'm so appreciative of you sharing your experience and your stories and your perspective. And I think it's just all about connection. I mean, I just hear it. I hear it. I hear how you connect with communities, with people, with places. So that's huge. So for any of my audience that wants to learn more about you, I'm looking forward to a book. I can't wait to read your book, but I'd love to hear. So how would they best connect with you, find you, learn more about what your work and what you're doing?
Well, yeah, I'm on social media. I'm on LinkedIn and Facebook and Instagram, and people can find me as my name, as Chevara Orrin. I have a couple of pieces that have been published. A piece that I wrote a couple of years ago that's in an academic text, and that's also in Tikkun magazine, a Jewish publication that's really about disrupting patriarchy. That's a piece that people might find interesting and might find useful. When you read it, it is not something, again, that I recommend that everyone do. It is a way that I have chosen to show up in the world and dismantle and disrupt misogyny and patriarchy based on my own lived experiences. And I certainly welcome any connections from your listening audience. Anyone who wants to be in community with me, please do not hesitate to reach out, and let's find a way that perhaps we can collaborate.
Great. I'll make sure to put the links in the show notes so they can connect with you directly. Thank you As always, Chevara, it's been such a pleasure talking with you. And I could just listen to you for hours, just listen to your stories for hours. So thank you so much. It was so great to be here with you.
So much for having me, Amy. Such a pleasure to be here.
Thank you for joining me for today's episode of the Blueprint Breakers podcast. Who are you from? And a very, very special, heartfelt thank you to today's guest, Chevara Orrin. Please be sure to check out the show notes, read her entire bio, and connect with her online. And to you, the listener, thank you. Thank you for your 5-star reviews on Apple Podcasts. Thank you for sharing this episode with your friends. And to be kept in the loop about what is happening here at Blueprint Breakers, sign up at community.blueprintbreakers.com. Have a wonderful week. Keep on breaking those blueprints and writing your own.